This meeting is being recorded.
Welcome, everybody. For those that are joining, we'll just give a couple of minutes to let people actually join. If you'd like to put your name, your organization, and the country from where you're joining into the chat, that would be great. It's nice to see who's actually joining us today. I'm just going to say it again for those that have joined it since I said it the first time. Welcome, everybody. We're just giving everybody a moment or two to actually join in. If you'd like to put your name in the chat, your organization, where you're joining us from, that would also be fantastic. I'm going to ask my tech crew if they think I can't see the number of people that have joined. Should I get started or wait a minute or two?
I think okay to get started, Alison.
Okay, great. Thank you. Excellent. Okay. So I've already said it, but I am going to say it again. Welcome, everybody, to today's session. I'm celebrating both International Women's Day, which was on the 8th of March, and World Water Day, which is coming up on the weekend on the 22nd of March, two such really critical issues. So it's really important that we actually take the time to acknowledge them. Before we launch into the session today, I just have a few housekeeping matters. The best way to sort of view what's going on for the presentations is actually a side-by-side /speaker screen, and there in your top right corner, you can change those. And when we open up the Q&A, it's best to go into the side-by-side gallery mode. So that's just helpful hints to get the most out of today's session. For anybody that would like to have closed captions, there's 3 dots down at the bottom and collect closed captions, and that will enable those to happen. In some of the variations of Zoom, it's actually there already. So you just need to sort of tick on that. And then finally, this webinar will be recorded, and we'll send a copy of it to all the registrations sort of within the week. So what I'd like to start with now is an acknowledgement of country, something we do in Australia, but I know there's many sort of around the globe that do a very similar theme. So we would just like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we gather today and their elders, past and present, who have lived on this land for millennia. We extend that respect to the traditional cultures and knowledge systems around the world that provide valuable insights for a sustainable future. We acknowledge our shared responsibility towards greater participation of all perspectives in the planning and decision-making of our future and the contributions that would help drive change towards a better tomorrow. So to kick off, we have an amazing set of speakers here joining us today. Tammy Malone will join us from DFAT. We're having a few technical issues, so we're hoping she's actually able to join and say a few words in a few moments. Myself, I'm the fund manager of the Water for Women Fund, Alison Baker, and we have our knowledge and learning manager as well, Sarah Balluri. Going into some of the detail today around a range of things, and I won't get into all the detail of that now, but looking at the criticality of GEDSI, we have Joe Smart, who's a GEDSI specialist in Water for Women, and Pasay Chea, the Equity and Inclusion Advisor for WaterAid. Then moving on to the next group, we have Dr. Jeremy Collitz, Research Director at UTS, the Institute of Sustainable Futures. Good idea, Jeremy, have a wave so people can find you easily. And Terea Wickham, the WASH Consortium Coordinator from World Vision, Papua New Guinea. Moving on then to the strengthening governance for climate resilient water systems, we're going to explore that theme through Fraser Goff, Regional System Strengthening Technical Lead from WaterAid, Nadira Kawaja, the Water Sector Leader from SNV Nepal, Nadira, I said that wrong, apologies Nadira, and Akila Savadas, the director for the Center for Advocacy and Research. I feel very privileged to be joining this group of people today. Amazing work that they have actually done. They're going to share their insights and their experience with us today, and you'll get an opportunity to ask them some questions and stuff as well. So I guess just before I hand over to sort of Tammy, I'm just going to check my sound system here and see whether Tammy's actually there. But I suppose just a very high level reflection. The Water for Women Fund has been an amazing journey that we've all been on together, worked together both internally within the fund as well as externally, really exploring all those different interlinkages between water, gender equality, inclusion, and climate resilience, which bring these two international days together so well. So really excited to share with you today where we've got to. So what I would like to do now, if our technology is allowing, is to hand over to Tammy Malone from DFAT. We've been working with Tammy for nearly a year now. That's hard to believe. And she would like to give some opening remarks. If our technology fails, we can hear Tammy, can we?
Yeah.
Excellent. I'm going to hand over to you, Tammy. Welcome.
Great. Thanks very much, Alison, and apologies everyone for being on the phone. I'm not I'm not always accustomed to joining these meetings on the phone, but this is the best way to approach it in this particular instance. So thanks so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. As Alison mentioned, I'm the current DFAT Water for Women Program Manager. It's a privilege to be here today to share insights from Water for Women's latest learnings on what does climate resilient inclusive WASH look like, to recognise and mark World Water Day on the 22nd of March, which is coming up, and International Women's Day, which recently passed. So Water for Women is DFAT's flagship water sanitation and hygiene program, which has a long legacy of successfully promoting GEDSI outcomes. Since 2018, Water for Women has worked, as many of you joining would be aware, in 16 countries in Southeast Asia, South Asia, and the Pacific to deliver 20 WASH projects via civil society organisations. And to date, the fund has supported more than 3.7 million people, including the most marginalised within communities. The fund's twin-track approach to gender equality, disability and social inclusion, including via mainstreaming and targeted interventions, has supported impressive outcomes for women and girls and marginalised groups. Through embedding intentional GEDSI approaches and strategies, Water for Women partners have shown the importance of inclusive WASH for supporting equity and empowerment of women, people with disabilities and other marginalised groups, as well as the difference to WASH outcomes when diverse voices are part of WASH decision-making processes. A focus on research and learning is another strength of Water for Women. Over the life of the fund, Water for Women has partnered with research organisations, undertake 20 research projects to address knowledge and evidence gaps, to support inclusive WASH and strengthened climate resilience. 14 innovation and impact grants have been provided, also provided a targeted opportunity for partners to further contribute to fund outcomes. In addition, the fund is pioneering in the sense that its second phase, so its current phase, which began last year, well, actually from 2023 onwards, was focused on climate resilient inclusive WASH. This is this area of climate resilience is a new area for donors and many working in the sector when it comes to WASH. There are many lessons which have emerged along the way through this second phase of the fund's program that will inform future WASH programming. As many of you will be aware, DFAT has commissioned an independent evaluation of the extension phase of Water for Women. The evaluation is expected to be finalised this month, with DFAT's management response published sometime in April or May. Findings from the evaluation will be used by DFAT to inform future climate resilient inclusive WASH programming And DFAT will work with its Climate Resilient Community Support Unit to develop guidance on climate resilient inclusive wash. Why Water for Women will come to a close in June of this year, sadly. Its impact and legacy will remain. DFAT is working closely with Water for Women program staff to ensure an appropriate transition to enable lessons from the fund to remain relevant and alive long after the program's completion. In the lead up to World Water Day and also in recognition of International Women's Day that has just passed, it's an honour to be here with you to open this important event, which will be focused on lessons from the fund concerning the recent What Does Climate Resilient Inclusive Wash Look Like, with highlights from Water for Women's latest consolidated briefs launched earlier this month. Thank you very much, and that's it from me. It's a pleasure to be here, and I look forward to learning with you.
Thank you, Tammy, providing firstly that overview of the fund, but also sharing your perspective on the contribution that it's made to the wash sector, but also gender and climate. We appreciate you taking your time today and also facing the technical challenges and getting that opportunity to speak. So thank you very much again. So as we celebrate both International Water Day and World Water Day, we celebrate that integral nature, as I mentioned before, between gender, water security, WASH, and how that contributes to climate resilient development. I think all of us would agree GEDSI is a really core approach to development that leaves no one behind. Making sure we actively involve all communities, women, men, marginalized groups, people with disabilities, ensures more equitable and inclusive processes which lead to more effective and sustainable outcomes in water sanitation and hygiene. But WASH is also a really critical entry point for advancing gender equality, disability equality, and social inclusion as well. So those things working together. And as we start exploring solutions to the challenges that climate change disruption creates, we're also seeing that WASH and GEDSI are key entry points to climate resilience as well. And we'll explore that as we go through. So just to set the scene very quickly today, before I hand over to our amazing speakers, I just thought it was opportune just to share a few reflections from the Water for Women Fund and what actually made it successful. So I think this helps really set the framework for the work that we're actually going into through the rest of the session. So firstly, a key factor has been the value of working in partnership, both within the fund, but also many of the colleagues around the world. So that willingness to share and exchange ideas has strengthened the outcomes that we've all been able to achieve collectively. Diverse perspectives create richer solutions for everybody. Everybody involved in the fund, CSOs, ROs, research organizations, national and local partners, and governments, as well as the communities themselves, were all an integral part of the achievements and successes. And a big part of sort of bringing those multi-level stakeholders to get together is also actually making sure we have the diverse perspectives of different sectors as well. Water, yes, but also health, education, livelihoods, meteorology is also critical, bringing those perspectives together so we can identify those future focused solutions, especially as the climate continues to change. And that combination of both targeted and mainstream GEDSI activities has resulted in some really positive change throughout the Water for Women projects. There's been an emergence of women leaders throughout the region, in government, local communities, businesses, and as entrepreneurs themselves, challenging social norms that are barriers to equality, not only for women, but people with disabilities, SOGIES communities, and other marginalized groups as well. The capabilities of women are being recognized in many of these settings, and many of the men around them are changing their attitudes. While there's still a lot of work to do, I think we'd all agree we started to create that change. And as a friend of mine once said, if you can do something a little, then you can do it a lot. So we've opened that door. We need to keep going further. There's obviously clear evidence that involving women in decision-making facilitates solutions that are more appropriate and sustainable. And practical examples of this are coming through in the Water for Women projects. I wanted to sort of share this quote from a lady within PNG, the World Vision team in Western Province, and she lives in the Wamarang village in South Fly. Being part of the WASH committee gave me the courage to speak up, not only for myself, but for all the women and children in our community. We have shown that when women are involved, solutions are more practical and impactful. So that's hearing from those communities actually themselves. Another example of this comes from a woman government official in Laos. It's been a privilege to be part of the team that received training and led the disability working group activities at the community level. As a district staff member, I previously had limited opportunities to participate in activities like this. Through this project, I've witnessed remarkable changes in community attitudes, particularly toward people with disabilities. Now there's greater acceptance and support, and people with disabilities are being welcomed and encouraged to participate in various activities. Community behavior has really shifted to be more inclusive and supportive. And I think hearing those real voices from the projects themselves is just so powerful. And I know we'll go into more of those a little bit later as we work through the learning agenda. But the entry point for all of these has been water and sanitation. It's been a vehicle for change and to drive towards transformation. But together, there's such an important foundation for health, well-being, and livelihoods of every individual. And both gender and water and social inclusion more broadly are fundamental to climate resilience. Water for Women's had impacts in remote and rural communities with subnational and national governments in areas where we're working, but it also had global influence for all the various partners involved. The work's been put into the UNDRR gender strategy, the Sanitation of Water for All gender strategy, World Bank guidelines, and discussions in terms of operationalizing the global goal for adaptation. The participation in things like the COPs, World Water Week, and World Water Forum provided opportunities for us to share and exchange ideas with others working in this space. That strengthened us all, but it's also contributed to the sustainability of the knowledge base that we're building, and that will be part of the legacy that's left behind. It will continue on. It's not just within those directly involved in the fund. The work of everyone involved in water security, WASH, gender and social inclusion, and climate change is critical for our future. We have our lessons to share, and I know many of you have your lessons to share as well. So together we can create that change, and we need to do it more quickly. So let's start with where we got to with Water for Women, and I look forward to the exchange a little bit later. But before I hand over to Zara Balouri, our K&L manager, we have a little video to share that captures some of the essence of that journey and that collaborative learning about climate resilient WASH. So hand over to the video, and then Zara will come back and talk after the end of it. So over to the video team.
Everything starts with water. Health, food, nature, and peace. Water is the thread that connects us. But climate change is unravelling it all. Floods, droughts, rising sea levels. Almost all climate disasters are water-related. Human activity has disrupted the world's water cycles, and marginalised communities experience the impacts first and worst. These dangers are amplified for the millions without access to water, sanitation and hygiene, WASH. And within these communities, some are more at risk than others. They are at the fraying edges as climate change unravels their basic needs. But people on the front lines of climate change have invaluable lessons to share. They're not waiting for heads of state to act. They're taking action now. They know what it takes to be resilient and reduce their risks from disasters. Yet their knowledge is the stitch often skipped and their voices unheard. But in this global crisis, knowledge is a blanket we must weave together. Each thread helps create solutions that make us stronger and more secure. So we're inviting these communities into the conversation to explore climate-resilient, inclusive WASH together. By bringing together voices from 16 countries across Asia and the Pacific, we're combining lived experience with scientific insight to co-create a sustainable future for all. We're committed to ensuring that every voice is heard and to closing the sanitation gap. Because WASH is vital for the health of our communities and our planet. By weaving diverse, inclusive solutions, we can craft a resilient future for everyone, stitch by stitch, thread by thread.
Such a great video, and thank you so much, Alison and Tammy, for those words. I think that video is even more meaningful now, given the past few weeks that we've all been through than ever, those strong messages of climate resilience and the importance of gender equality, disability, and social inclusion. So before we hear from the 3 learning groups who have been part of the Water for Women Fund learning agenda, we might just take a couple of skips backwards to sort of explain where this all came about 2 years ago and why did we come up with a learning agenda and learning questions and these learning answers that we're going to hear from in a minute. So Water for Women is quite a unique fund. Not only did it support implementation, but also research. And it's quite unusual to be able to work with top researchers from Australia and from the region, some of whom we have on the call here, but also practitioners who are implementing the water and sanitation programs on the ground from Cambodia to PNG throughout all of the 16 countries. So 2 years ago, we came together with all of the fund partners, all of those organizations you just saw the logos of. And we thought, well, what could be a really practical contribution that we can all give to the sector? And we came up with the wording for a learning question. And so next slide, please. This is the collaborative question that we wanted to answer. What does climate resilient inclusive WASH look like? So beyond the definitions, what does it actually look like? Because a lot of our partners are implementing climate resilient inclusive WASH that works, that's evidence-based, and that can be scaled up. So this is the overarching question that we all worked together to answer. And just very quickly, that was broken down into 3 sub-questions. So 3 groups that then went off over the past 2 years with their own methodology and answered 3 parts of this question. This will make sense as you hear from each of these 3 groups. Next slide, please. But before we go to the 3 groups, we would also like to, as we are explaining the learnings from these 3 groups, we would like to ask you the same question. So here's a Menti. Also in the chat, I think we've got the Menti instructions. If you go to menti.com and enter that number. What does climate resilient inclusive WASH mean to you in your context? So if, as you're listening to these presentations, you have some ideas or something you want to share or a project or a question, you can add that into that Menti and we will revisit that at the end of the presentation today. So that will, I think the slide will go, but you still have in the chat the Menti instructions. So the first of these 3 learning groups that I just mentioned, their question that they wanted to answer was, why and how is GEDSI, gender equality, disability and social inclusion, critical to climate resilient WASH? So that was led by WaterAid and the Water for Women Fund coordinator and all of the partners you can see there on the screen. So we'll hear from them in a minute. The second group worked on the question, how do WASH programs commonly understand climate risk and resilience? So we found throughout our work that there were different definitions and different understandings of terms like risk and resilience, both within the fund, but also externally. So going to the IPCCC or the Sendai framework, slight nuances between the definitions. This is the group that looked into that. That was led by UTS-ISF, Jeremy, and he is on the call today to explain the findings of this group. The third group, next slide please, looked at governance systems. So how do governance systems for inclusive climate resilient WASH integrate risk and resilience? So really taking a systems governance approach, not just individual programs, but looking at the whole ecosystem and the whole system. And that was led by WaterAid. We'll hear from Fraser and his team today. And next slide, please. Rushing through because I want to get to the findings of the 3 groups. So 3 groups all came up with some very high level, 5 sort of common takeaways. And these were that first one, inclusive WASH is essential for climate resilient WASH. So in a nutshell, inclusion is essential for climate resilient development. The second one, adaptable systems and inclusive governance are vital. to this ever-changing context we find ourselves in. The third one, climate resilience must be embedded in all phases of WASH programs: planning, budgeting, monitoring, evaluation, and learning. Next slide, please. Marginalised groups, such as women, offer vital knowledge, capacities, and resilience from their lived experience. So without including them, we won't be able to do climate resilient development. And then the final one, and this fund, and this is an example of cross-sector collaboration, where we have people from different sectors all working together to find solutions to these common problems that we all face. And with that, I would like to hand over to our first group, the GEDSI group, and Jose and Pisse, who will be presenting on behalf on the criticality of GEDSI for climate resilient WASH. Thanks, Jose.
Thank you, Zara. Thanks very much. And a very warm hello to everyone. It's great to be here today to not only acknowledge these the significance of these two global days and the critical connections between both, but also to share with you the rich learnings from Water for Women partners in answering this very important question. Next slide, please, Rose. So, why and how is GEDSI critical to climate resilient WASH, as Zara just mentioned before? And in doing so, we wanted to identify 3 sub-questions in helping us to answer this question. The first around identifying the structural barriers to access and decision-making. The second, identifying the pathways to actively address these barriers, and in so doing, supporting transformative change. And thereby exploring the linkages between inclusion, transformation, and climate resilient WASH. Next slide. First, the why. So this quote answers this in part. We know well that women and the world's most structurally disadvantaged people are on the front line of climate change. And because of pre-existing power imbalances and inequalities, they are especially vulnerable to its impacts. But while this vulnerability lens is important in that we need to know who is being most affected and how, we also need to move beyond this to also understand the important knowledges, experience, and capacities that exist among diverse people and groups, and therefore what they can and do bring to the decision-making table for climate resilient solutions. It is this strengths-based approach that is so central to this learning brief. Next slide. Just quickly, a very, very quick but big shout out to the working group members listed here who steered the process over close to 2 years, and also to the 14 project teams from 9 different countries who collected the data to inform the learning brief, and to Sue Cavell, who was the lead author. Next slide. So these are the key messages that were drawn out from the synthesis of all the data from the 14 project teams. And I won't go through these in detail. You'll be able to see them in the learning brief. But I'd just like to touch on 2 of them briefly. Firstly, the role of transformative GEDSI. That is, supporting deeper processes to shift harmful and exclusionary norms for greater equity and inclusion in the nexus of climate and WASH interventions. And secondly, how inclusive and accessible WASH approaches can strengthen resilience capacities for all in the community. Next slide, please. Okay, so now to the how. An integral part of the learning brief was identifying these barriers to access and decision-making for women, people with disabilities, and other marginalised groups. And as you can see, they are categorised into 5 dimensions: social, habitat, institutional, financial, and technical. And if we look at them in this order, it helps, because it means that with the right contextually appropriate pathways, approaches, or stepping stones in place, we can shift these barriers to become enablers for change. Next slide, please. Okay, so you can scan this figure if it's a bit difficult to see, but this is the figure that appears in the learning brief and really encapsulates the key points of the learning brief and is best viewed from left to right. So from the left, we can see that community members, including those most marginalised, possess inherent coping mechanisms and adaptive capacities due to their lived experience, as was talked about earlier. However, due to pervasive social and gender inequalities, the barriers we looked at in the previous slide can limit their access and decision-making capacities, thereby exacerbating their vulnerabilities to the risks and impacts of climate change. But these resilience capacities can be strengthened for and by everyone in the community when these inequalities are proactively reduced through intentional implementation of the stepping stones. In this way, inclusive WASH interventions allow for a transformative shift from barriers to enablers to achieve not just community resilience, but whole of community resilience. In the learning brief, you'll discover many different examples from our partners of how this has occurred through their intentional GEDSI programming. But now I have great pleasure in handing over to Pisay, who is here to talk about how this has worked in WaterAid's WASH projects in Timor-Leste and PNG. Over to you, Pisay. Thank you.
Hello everyone, and happy International Women's Day and World Water Day. Thank you for highlighting the critical role of inclusion, transformations, and climate resilience in WASH. Next, I'd like to showcase WaterAid works on gender equality, disability, and social inclusions in Papua New Guinea and Timor-Leste. So let's get started. Imagine a mother walking a few hours across hills every day just to collect water for her family. And when drought hits, the journey becomes even longer and the risk of facing violence along the way might increase. Life is on hold. This is the daily reality for many women in rural Papua New Guinea and Timor-Leste where we were. But here is the question. Who decides who gets water first? Who shapes the water solutions? Surprisingly, the answer is not the woman carrying the burden. In many parts of the Papua New Guinea, a traditional system of big man leadership means men make decisions about water resources. Women's voices are not heard when it comes to managing the resources that directly impact their life. As a result, WASH policies and plans are gender neutral, assuming that everyone is the same, but they are not. So when we ignore the needs of women, girls, and people with disability in WASH, we miss out on more sustainable and effective solutions. Think about water systems designed without input from them. They may overlook critical issues like affordability, accessibility, and different barriers they face. Without considering these perspectives, systems might fail to address the extra burdens on women in collecting water or be inaccessible to those with disability, leaving them further marginalized. So this lack of inclusivity creates systems that do not truly serve the community. Therefore, climate resilient and inclusive WASH are about creating systems that work for everyone. Here is where things change. In Papua New Guinea, we partner with the ISFIC Council of Women and ISFIC Disabled Persons Agency. We strengthen their capacity and facilitate their participation to ensure their voices are included in WASH decision-making bodies. This is not just about giving them a seat at the table, it's about supporting them to derive solutions. As a result, the District 5-year WASH plan from 2024 to 2028 in Viwa District is the first plan to recognize the different needs and barriers of diverse users. And in Timor-Leste, we conduct a scoping study and a gender-sensitive vulnerability mapping to highlight the different vulnerability and the needs of women, girls, elderly, and people with disability regarding WASH services. This evidence laid the foundation for advocacy and the integrations of GEDSI into the subnational WASH planning. And rights-holder organizations use the evidence to advocate for the inclusions of GEDSI priority in the parliamentary processes, ensuring that WASH budget reflect the needs of vulnerable groups. And additionally, a key WASH actor in Timor-Leste have been equipped with GEDSI tool to integrate the GEDSI issue into the WASH development. As a result, the municipal WASH plan were revised to include budget for GEDSI activity, ensure universal design, accessible infrastructure, and promote climate resilient services. Additionally, the community SCAD now include new indicators to ensure women participation in the decision making. In short, by prioritizing inclusion, we ensure everyone have access to WASH services. We empower marginalized community, especially women and persons with disability, by addressing structural barriers and creating opportunity to participate in WASH solutions. Therefore, inclusion, transformations, and climate change are interconnected as they collectively empower diverse voice to shape adaptable and resilient solutions that meet their needs and thrive in the face of climate challenges. Thank you. I'd like to hand over to Dr. Jeremy.
Thank you, Pise. That was a wonderful case study. So I'm presenting on behalf of the Water for Women Learning Agenda brief on integrating risk and resilience for climate resilient WASH programming. And I'm presenting along with my colleague, Terea Wickham, who is formerly a WASH Consortium coordinator, but currently a stakeholder engagement and partnership coordinator at World Vision Papua New Guinea. So next slide, please. So in this learning agenda brief, I guess I'll start by asking an open question. For those of you in attendance, how many of you feel really confident about understanding climate change concepts and terminology? And how many of you feel like you have an intuitive grasp of what it means for WASH services and systems? And I think a lot of us honestly don't have those things yet. And having worked in the space of climate resilient WASH for several years now, I find that the hardest thing to engaging with climate resilient WASH is even knowing where to begin and penetrating all the dense jargon and concepts and theories. So one of the things that we wanted to do in this learning agenda was sort of demystify some of the core concepts that you hear in climate change discourse, and risk and resilience are two really common ones that you'll hear a lot. And we wanted to draw on the experiences of our partners within the Water for Women Fund to sort of articulate clearly what is risk and resilience and put it in practical terms without adding on to more and more theory and concepts that honestly a lot of practitioners and researchers for that matter find difficult to engage with. So in this learning agenda brief, we cover briefly and in easy to understand and easy to grasp terms, the concepts of risk and resilience, and we give tangible, grounded examples of how those are addressed in climate resilient WASH practice. So in this presentation, I'm going to go really briefly through over those, but of course you can read about them more in the agenda brief itself. So next slide, please. So risk, really briefly, is an easier concept to understand. A risk, simply put, is the potential for an adverse outcome. So it's something bad that could happen. So that could include a water shortage, pathogens being spread, disruption of WASH services, loss of access to WASH services. And oftentimes when we say a climate risk, we're talking about risks in which climate variability or climate change is a significant contributor to that risk. But of course, these four examples on the screen, these all exist in the absence of climate change as well. Even in a world without climate change, we would have these things. And that's because there's other drivers of these risks than just climate variability and climate change. And oftentimes, an absence of gender equality and disability and social inclusion are actually strong contributors to things like disruption of services or loss of access, or even these other things, water shortages and pathogen spreads. So one thing that we talk about in the learning brief is that although WASH sector actors commonly understand risk in terms of the physical terms, it's really important to consider social, institutional, political influencers as risk as well. And that means you can address risk not just through physically improving infrastructure, but you can address risks through GEDSI as well. And we also talk a little bit about how to characterize risks beyond just severity and likelihood. Next slide, please. Now, resilience is much more, it's much harder to tackle. There's lots of different thinking and lots of really interesting frameworks and theories about what creates resilience. And when we ask what is climate resilient WASH, if we want to define it as an outcome, well, we can say it's WASH services and systems that continue to work despite climate change. Okay, fine, great. It's a WASH service that works despite climate change. What we really want to know is what's going to make the system work despite climate change. And it's a difficult question to answer because it's kind of like saying, well, what can we do that will solve the climate change problem? It'll make our WASH system services and systems so strong that even climate change doesn't disrupt them. And of course, we'll probably never fully answer that question. We've been asking ourselves a lot for many years now, what makes a WASH system sustainable? And it's a similar challenge. We have ideas and practices that we can replicate, but it's always hard to put those into practice, and it's hard to know definitively in any context what will make a system sustainable or resilient. But to try to put it into simple terms, you can think of two things. Resilience requires fundamentally good WASH systems as a foundation, and then on top of that, we need to do climate risk management. If we don't have the foundation, the fundamentally good systems, then it doesn't matter if you're trying to address a specific flood risk or a specific drought risk, because your system's not even working in the first place, or it's not even reaching everyone in the first place. If you don't have an equitable system, it doesn't matter if it's great against floods or droughts if certain people aren't even connected to the system to begin with. But likewise, if we have a fundamentally good WASH system, but we're climate blind and we're completely ignoring flood and drought risks, then those systems won't work for long because we're designing them for a world that doesn't really exist anymore. Now we're in a climate change context where things are fundamentally changing, and we need to have specific measures to address specific risks. Now, if you could forward the slide one more. Fundamentally good WASH systems doesn't mean business as usual. Doesn't mean just business as usual. A lot of the things that we consider to be good for sustainability and equity are still relevant, but some things we might need to fundamentally transform. Things that have worked in the past, we might need to change because climate change is changing the operating context, or certain things may truly have never really worked for everyone in the past, and we need to try new things and transform certain aspects of WASH systems to make them work for everyone and make them work in a world of climate change. And to me, that's a really big question the sector needs to ask itself is, what should we continue doing well that we're confident we need to continue investing in? And in what context and at what times do we need to think, you know what, this is not working anymore. We need to completely change our service delivery model, our infrastructure, or the way we govern systems. So in the next slide, we did have a go within the Water for Women Fund to think about what would make a a WASH system more climate resilient. And you'll see lots of frameworks, and they offer up lots of concepts such as these. And there's no one framework that's entirely correct, but this is as good as any of the others. And you'll see that a lot of the concepts on the screen right now will appear in other climate resilient WASH frameworks. And the main contribution of the Learning Agenda brief is that we provide grounded examples of each one of these things. So I'm not going to go through this entire framework in this talk because we don't have enough time, but you'll see elements of things that would go into that bottom part of the pyramid, things that contribute to a fundamentally good WASH system, and some things like the risk-informed and adaptability concepts that might fit more into the top part of that pyramid that I showed. But to give you a taste of what these concepts mean in the context of climate resilience and WASH, you can see the Learning Agenda brief for examples for all 9. But now I'm going to hand to my colleague, Treya Wickham, and she's going to zoom in, I believe, on number 4 and speak to how the work that World Vision does contributes to climate resilience through improving sustainability. So thanks, Treya.
Thanks, Jeremy. Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? Just give me a thumbs up. Awesome. First of all, like Jeremy said, I think for us, it's been a wonderful journey, and just while I have the floor, just a big thank you to, I think, the Water for Women Fund and everyone involved, because what the learning agenda provided for all of us working under the Water for Women flag was a safe space for us to say, okay, we're okay with not knowing what climate resilience looks like, and we were able to talk through that and have those conversations. And I think what has come up is something that we are happy that we contributed to and had conversations with our partners and everyone else on the ground. So one of the quotes that when we were asked to give quotes was something that I've been thinking about, and it's that sustainability isn't about working alone. It's about working smarter together, stronger partnerships, local leadership, and a commitment to learning. And we hope that even after the fund, we can continue on that learning, and that can inform future WASH interventions around the country, around the region as well. Next slide, please. So in terms of looking at sustainability in climate resilient WASH, in the Western Province, World Vision worked with, under the WAVE project, World Vision worked with communities in the Western Province, and we supported the subnational and government, so the district government and the provincial governments in the Western Province, establishing 2 district WASH committees. So these are looking at embedding in these existing governance structures, embedding concepts of climate resilient WASH, disaster risk reduction into the WASH committees and the work they do. So the WASH committees were supported to develop plans, targets, and budgets, and that they are also monitored and reviewed annually. So in the WASH committees, which are very community-based, they have the support from the projects and also the government as well through their district WASH plans. So looking at sustainability and having that embedded in existing governance structures, so that once a project ends, the government is able to take that on. So the South Flight District, we've seen really good examples of governments getting on board with that. They've included funded public service positions dedicated to WASH service delivery. And for us, that's been a big gain in the project areas, and we hope to see that replicated around the country. There is also oversight and directions through these WASH plans, and the implemented approach also supports institutional capacity to increase sustainability. Next slide, please. So what have we learned about sustainability? Really quickly, we looked at community ownership and participation. That's looking at engaging local communities, which, you know, there's lots of pictures to show, but we don't have the time. But I hope you can pick that up on the website as well as the learning briefs. We also look at strong governance and policy alignment, aligning with PNG's national WASH policy and all the other related policies, the WASH in Schools policy, as well, the National Health Plan, and also under the Water for Women Fund, WaterAid also led the development of the National WASH standards and guidelines for healthcare facilities. So using all of those policies and governance structures to embed the work that we do in the government systems. We also looked at sustainability in terms of financial mechanisms and cost recovery. So looking at developing sustainable financing models. That's a big task for all of us and a challenge, no doubt, but it's something that we want to look into even more. And I know that WaterAid was looking at water kiosks in Pari Village, which has been a great learning for a whole lot of partners across the fund. The fourth one is also looking at capacity building and local expertise, training community members as well as local government and service providers in maintenance and infrastructure services. And I think the final one was looking at climate resilience and appropriate technologies and how we can use those to sustain WASH systems into the future. Yeah, thanks, Jeremy. I hope I covered everything. And I'd like to pass it on to Fraser, who is the Regional System Strengthening Technical Lead for WaterAid. Over to you, Fraser.
Thank you, Toraya, and thanks everyone. A reminder as I get started to please add your questions into the Q&A box for us to come back to at the end of this section. So it's a great pleasure to share some of the highlights from the Learning Agenda Group looking at strengthening governance for climate resilient inclusive WASH systems. And I have the privilege to be joined today by Nadra Khawaja, who is the water sector leader from SNV Nepal, and Akila Sivadas, who's the director from CFAR in India. In our group, we were discussing governance. It was one of the bubbles in Jeremy's diagram on your previous slide. Governance encompassing the systems, the structures, and the processes that are essential for delivering sanitation and water services that benefit everyone. Systems, structures, and processes that need to be resilient themselves in times of crisis and disaster caused by climate change. The reason we considered these questions in this learning brief is because it's essential that we not only implement programs and projects that consider climate risk and climate integration at a project level, but those climate risks and resilience are integrated into governance processes at government and community level. This ensures that we can minimize duplication and siloing. It helps to embed GEDSI and inclusion into those resilience efforts and processes, and it encourages approaches to resilience that will continue beyond the life of the project. As a group, what did we do? Firstly, we reviewed existing global guidance on climate risk and resilience and on WASH governance. That review identified that most guidance focuses on questions of what are the entry points for climate risk in WASH governance? What services need to become more climate resilient and what processes need to be improved? We identified that the added value from the Water for Women Fund was to focus on questions of how to effectively integrate climate risk and resilience into those government and governance functions. Next slide, please. So from across the fund, we identified 8 promising practices which emerged from one or more Water for Women projects. I won't go into all of these in detail. I'll leave that for you to read in our learning brief. But they do cover elements such as making sure that we are not just creating standalone climate-oriented processes, such as a climate risk assessment, but making sure that those processes are embedded as part of WASH planning and WASH monitoring. Making sure that we're not creating new and duplicate tools. Governments that we spoke to across the fund complained of the burden of new climate risk tools and new processes which didn't well align or fit with their existing processes that they already use in WASH governance. We also discussed the essential need to pool sources of finance so that we're not separately implementing WASH programs and climate programs, but making sure that we're bringing together international financing and domestic public financing to holistically address the underlying capacity and governance issues that prevent climate resilient WASH governance. We have 2 excellent project leaders on the call today, and I'd like to invite Nadra firstly to talk briefly to promising practice number 1 here about integrating climate risk into existing WASH processes. Nadra, can you talk a little bit about how your project has integrated climate risk into existing WASH planning processes and tools?
Thanks a lot, Fraser. Good day, everybody. So I wanted to share a bit of experience that we had together with our partners who are Everest Club, IMI, ISF, and CBM Australia in working with local governments in the rural areas of Nepal. And I would specifically like to share experience in the hilly part of the country and a district called Dailek. So basically, our aim from the beginning of the project was that we need to support local governments to lead the process of climate risk-informed planning and implementation, focusing on water supply for their whole area. So for them to lead the process, we looked at what are then the existing systems and tools that the country already had, and that they could then implement and adopt and leverage to improve, the application within their own area. And in that, for WASH planning, in 2022, the country passed a WASH Act, and the WASH Act mandates all local governments to use the national WASH MIS system, which started developing approximately around 2017-18 and has been in, an evolving process since then. And this system, amongst other aspects, collects data on the status of all water supply systems in the municipality, as well as it tells us where areas remain unserved. An important part of this system is that it's based on inventory data, and it actually then, in a report format, calculates the pre-feasibility level costs needed to repair and upgrade any water supply systems. Now, having said that, the MIS actually has a lot of other data, and the project then analyzed the other data and found that in addition to having the status and inventory of existing systems, there is also data in the system that can be extracted to integrate climate risks and calculate these. So specifically, the MIS system has data on risks to water supply systems from disaster and climate change impacts. So we supported the local governments to extract and use this data and then identify systems that they wanted to invest in based on high risk from climate impacts, as well as other parameters that are important to ensure inclusion, which we've heard throughout this webinar so far. So that also included areas that were unserved or that there was low access to the marginalized Dalit population, and then where overall services were also low. So based on these climate risk parameters and inclusion parameters, then the local governments prioritized their investments because they've got limited resources. So that prioritization is very important. And then that prioritization was reflected in the WASH plan that they made. Importantly, then we also helped them to actually cost that. What is the cost of adding risk mitigation measures? For example, how do you protect your upper catchment area? How do you protect your source? And then add those costs in the WASH plan. And then after the WASH plan, to support the local governments and the service providers, which are largely community-based service providers, to actually implement and sustain services, we supported the implementation of the climate resilient water safety planning tool. Again, this was a tool that had already been endorsed by the government. We just supported its strengthening, how to improve it, and then how to build the capacity of the local government to apply it. And and then they also, I wanted to add, then they actually also adopted it as standard operating procedure within the local governments themselves. And I just also, Fraser, maybe I can further share that the benefit of integrating these tools and not creating new ones, there are so many useful tools globally, but I think the biggest benefit is ownership and leadership. And then it makes the process of institutionalization easy, and as well as continuous capacity building after the project closes, because it's the government's endorsed tool. So there are opportunities for capacity building through the federal government in the long term as well. Thanks a lot.
Fantastic. And such a great insight on ownership there. Thank you, Nadira. I'd also like to bring in Akila now. Akila is the director of CFAR in India. And Akila, I wanted to specifically refer to promising practice number 5 here, which relates, it's not on the screen, but it relates to accountability and inclusive governance processes. And I think we can also touch on the following one as well, around participation of community and rights holders in accountability of climate risk governance. Akila, from your project perspective, why is community participation, empowerment, and accountability important to effectively integrate climate risk and resilience into WASH governance?
Thank you. Thank you, Fraser. Just to illustrate, I'm taking one ward, Ward 38. When we started, we applied a simple, sort of formula. If you flip a problem, you get the solution. And what was the problem that got presented? When we sort of did a participatory assessment with the support of right holders organizations and community institutions and platforms, we found that with about 3,100 households and about over 12,000 population, almost 346 households and 1,100 populations were severely impacted by climate. And to sort of compound the situation, we had just entered the new wards in 2023. So from August 2023 to December 2024, we had to mitigate and reduce the risk that 346 households or 1,100 populations were experiencing. The numbers look small, but the challenges were daunting and the problems huge. In all these 5 settlements, they are home to highly marginalized populations, indigenous groups, scheduled castes, women, and within them a large section of single women, persons with disability, elderly, and with a majority of them, preponderant section of them, residing on the banks of a canal or open drains, not having any access to what we call municipal water supply by then, even though the Clean India mission, the entire sanitation programming had been on for the last 10 years. They were still not having access to safe water. And of course, a large chunk were also situated in low-lying areas. So there was no option but to ensure community participation, empowerment, and accountability. And we had to draw attention to this in a loud and no holds barred manner. And this was not possible without community being the vanguard and spearheading the change. And this is a realization that even the nodal ministry, the Ministry of Housing and Urban Affairs, in a report in 2020, accept that they can improve WASH inclusion, sanitation inclusion, water inclusion, but cannot guarantee the inclusion of everybody living in urban slums. That is something that they need support and partnerships. And so this is where we stepped in, everything from renovation, repairing or damaged drains to everything from laying the water pipelines to ensuring that toilets are accessible during flood, everything, and pruning trees, rewiring electric wires, everything was done in that period of time. And this was possible because we set up what we call geographically hierarchical structures. At the settlement level was the Community Management Committee and the sanitation subcommittee. At the ward level, we had the single window forum. And at the city and the project level, we had the multi-stakeholder forum. We redefined the definition of system to include community agency and voice as an institution. We built their capacity, actively got them to participate, everything from inception to generating demand to doing participatory assessment to a series of community consultations to ensure that decisions are taken not by a coterie, but by the entire community. We ensured after that micro-level planning. The planning was then converted into WASH improvement proposals in collaboration with the WASH system. Once that was done, there were ward-level review meetings to validate all of that and get everybody's consent and involvement. And then we did not, brook any sort of waste any time. We did not get into any haggling or hustling. We just went straight into execution because everything has short validation. When you work with the system, there are many, many risks that, communities face. Governments change, things, suddenly sort of topple over. So we did not waste any time. We rushed in. And in this entire period between August 23 and December 24, we ensured almost 100% inclusion and reduction of risk and mitigation. It also snowballed into many kinds of participatory groups, from self-help groups to women's forums to male forums, all kinds of adolescent forums, and all of them contributed. And this is something that we are confident Whether the project exists or not, this momentum and dynamics is going to continue in the times to come. Thank you, Fraser. Over to Nadira. No, over to Zahra.
Oh, thank you, Akila. And I would highly encourage everyone to go and look at CFAR India's incredible work that Akila was just speaking about on the Water for Women website. We'll provide the links at the end. So next we have a little bit of time for Q&A. But before we do that, why don't we have a look at how the Menti's going? And that will give people a bit of an opportunity to also ask some more questions in the Q&A. We have some here. Feel free to just go and put in any questions for the speakers, comments, while we just have a quick look at the Menti. So, and it's so incredible to see so many people from different contexts. We've got people on the call from Africa, we've just heard from India, Papua New Guinea. All right, so we asked you at the beginning of this call, what does climate resilient, inclusive WASH mean to you in your context? So we don't have the countries, but we can just imagine these are from all over the world, really. So have a read of these. So people are talking a lot about community-led and sustainability. So inclusive WASH means locally led, accessible, participation, being available to everyone in forms that meet their needs at all times, people with disabilities, not a one-size-fits-all solution. And that's what we've been hearing, isn't it? That it's very contextually driven and locally led. And of course, yeah, risk-informed planning, inclusive processes on capacity strengthening at local government, community, adequate financing. Okay, so feel free to keep adding to that Menti. We might go to our, say, 10-minute questions and answers session now. Okay, so I'm going to click here, see what questions we have. So first up, we have Prashanto, who says, Akila, this might be one for you actually, because it talks about urban contexts. And I know in Jaipur and Bhubaneswar, CFAR is working in very urban contexts. So Prashanto says, could you please briefly share the barrier and learning of GEDSI and climate change in urban contexts, specifically grey water management, fecal sludge management, solid waste, drainage, and early warning systems? Do you have any thoughts on that one, Akila?
Yes.
Over to you.
The biggest barrier, which, Jo's mentioned in her presentation, the entire structural barriers, the barriers around gender unaware to gender unresponsive, all of that needs to be, first tackled. That's very, very critical, because without the voice and agency of that section, Jeremy also mentioned about it, without GEDSI, that's where the, element of, transformative change happens. So that's the first thing, to put them into the leadership, to ensure that, they become the drivers, not just, passive recipients of service, but actual, active sort of, promoters and contributors to inclusive WASH service. So that's the first barrier that we have to tackle. To tackle that barrier, they need to be as much, knowledge is actually a very mutual process. So if what you know, I may not know. So what the community knows, the WASH system needs to know, and what the WASH system does not know, or the community does not know, it has to learn from the WASH system. So that mutual transfer of knowledge, and more important, mutual or influencing mindset, because the structures are rigid, hierarchical, very sort of status and stature conscious. So all of that has to be changed. And all of that can only happen when there is, active participation and involvement, and you actually bring governance down to the people and not, keep pushing people up to the, governments. You have to make it completely, to invert the process. Zara.
Excellent. Thank you, Akila, for that answer. We have another one here from Prashanto, who perhaps Fraser, maybe this one's a good one for you. Could you please share your experience, engagement of private sector by local government institute to ensure the timely and qualitative WASH services, and any functional governance framework which might be replicated, and the learning of data governance? So a few questions there. Fraser, over to you. Any thoughts on these 3 points?
Sure. Thanks, Prashanto. Good to have your insightful questions. I'll start with the second one first, which is in the learning group looking at governance. We didn't develop a new framework. We utilised existing frameworks for water governance, in particular one produced by SIWI, which was developed alongside the Sanitation and Water for All building blocks. If you refer to our publication, we used that to assess various other guidelines and documents related to governance, and used that as a useful framing. And I think it's one thing that it adds that not many other frameworks use is the idea that the way the governance systems function is underpinned by the values and aspirations of those who are involved in decision making. And obviously, particularly when we're talking about GEDSI, that is such an integral part of system governance that we do want to be shifting in terms of who's at the decision-making table, but also what the values are in terms of inclusion and equality. On the last question there about data governance, one of the promising practices we identified was that it's important in addressing climate resilience of WASH services to not only draw on available scientific data, but also customary and traditional knowledge and data. There's a very nice case study from the International Water Centre and the Solomon Islands National University looking at community water safety planning that draws on not only the limited available projections for climate change in the Solomon Islands, but also really embedding that community engagement process in communities' knowledge passed down through generations about climate change and resilience and adaptation. And I encourage you to find that one and read that for some examples about data use. A short response to your private sector question there, which we didn't really look so much at in governance, but drawing on WaterAid's project experience from Parry Village in Port Moresby in Papua New Guinea, is the importance, I guess, of having the governance frameworks and structures in place to enable that. WaterAid's been working through our Water for Women project in Papua New Guinea in the consortium together with Turea and other organisations there in PNG to establish a new service delivery agency in Parry, which is not entirely private sector, but there are individual franchisees within that model who run the kiosks to deliver water to people in those in that village, that urban village. And really, it's around having the right structures and memoranda in place to enable that service model to function effectively and to enable the flows of finance from the service users to the various people that need to be paid for their services. And so, yeah, really thinking about the governance structures and systems in order to enable private sector to flourish.
Thanks, Fraser. And I think we have time for one more question. We have here, what are some potential gaps when it comes to resilience that other sectors pay attention to, but WASH stakeholders may be overlooking? I wonder, Jeremy, is that something that you might have some thoughts on?
Sure, I'll briefly speak to that one, as we touched on this a bit in the learning agenda brief as well. So when we were talking about risk and resilience, we mainly explored how do WASH stakeholders within the fund and without external to the fund think about risk and resilience. But we also did interviews with non-WASH people entirely and asked them what does resilience mean to them, and tried to see if they talked about different things. And there was a lot of overlap, but there were a few different things that I'll just try to quickly highlight here. So one thing that other people talked about was the environment a lot. So I think the WASH sector has a strong appreciation of water resources, the physical reservoirs of water on which WASH depend, but we don't talk as much about the ecosystems. And we know that ecosystems provide purification services, they provide regulation services, and ecosystems, and that's the flora and the fauna that live in the water catchments, are under stress from climate change as well. And that's going to have flow-on effects for WASH. And I think it's something we don't talk about as much in the WASH sector, although I've seen WaterAid has included some focus on ecosystems in some of their latest publications on climate resilient WASH. A second one is a lot of the stakeholders we talk about long-term planning, and this comes up in high-income countries and places like city planning or urban planning. I think in the WASH sector, we have a tradition of focusing on people's immediate needs because we know people are suffering right now and we want to do humanitarian work. We want to reach those people immediately. But the most profound effects of climate change will come 20, 30, 40 years in the future where there's really, really disastrous things if we don't get climate or global warming under control. And we could start to think about how do things really need to change in a big way decades from now. One more example, so I leave enough time for everyone else. Strengthening the workforce came up a bit. So we often say, well, the local government has to do this and this and this, and we have to remember that the human beings that are on the front line behind that. It's exhausting work if people have to repeatedly respond to disaster events. So in addition to providing the resourcing for local government authorities, I think we also have to recognize that these people are increasingly under stress and having to respond to water and sanitation services being disrupted, and providing them with the right support, which could even be psychological support, it could be the right training to make sure that those people are really well taken care of. And there's a couple more examples in the learning brief, but I'll stop there for the sake of time. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Jeremy. These are such huge topics, and there are a lot of examples, tools, briefs, policy notes on the website. So feel free to go and have a look at those if you're looking for anything to do with GEDSI, climate change. There's a few of them on the slide there. Okay, thank you very much, presenters. With that, I'm going to hand back to Alison Baker, Fund Manager, who will finish up with looking at what's next. Thanks, Alison.
Thank you, Zara, and thank you to our panelists, and apologies if anybody has a burning desire to say something, but I know some of you get an opportunity to give some closing remarks. So if there was a question or two or a comment that you want to make, please feel free to weave that into some of the closing remarks. So we've definitely heard sort of a rich suite of different examples and really exploring what does make up climate resilience and all the different sort of aspects to that. But what's probably most important is, well, what do we do with this? What is next? Where do we go next? There's all these tools, as Zara's just flagged, that we've and all of our partners we've collectively developed. So those are all of those learning briefs are available, and there's also a whole range of tools available that you can sort of look at yourself, sort out what's going to be useful in my context, and how do I actually take this thinking forward and continue to build on it. I think we know we've been on a journey, we've got to this point, but the journey continues. There's a lot of learning still to go, and there's a number of things that will come out over the next sort of couple of months as we finish up the fund. But to give some reflections from, as I said, some of our panelists in terms of what they think is next for them or their organizations or the sector, I'd like to give the opportunity for each of those individuals to give a couple of their thoughts and views. So we'll start out with Nadara Khawaja from SNB Nepal, and over to you.
Thanks a lot, Alison. My main reflections are basically in view of the upcoming days. So 2025 is the International Year of Glaciers Preservation. And we are also celebrating globally the first World Glaciers Day on March 21st. And then the theme of the upcoming World Water Day is also glacier preservation. So that's really critical for us because glaciers are a sensitive indicator to climate change. And recently I learned through another webinar I attended that globally 5.4%, there has been a reduction of 5.4% in the glacial mass since 2000, owing largely to climate change. And for the area where we live in Nepal and the whole Hindu Kush Himalaya region and the river basins, it's very critical, and livelihoods and economies literally of billions of people are supported by glaciers and the wider cryosphere. So basically it means with all of this glacial melt, it directly impacts the volume and the timings of river flows and how your water availability then varies across whole regions and river basins. So I think this learning that we've shared today and bringing together the lessons from Water for Women Fund, the many projects and countries, are even more meaningful, and highlighting not just what we have seen through our own projects, but jointly what we have seen through the fund, and improving our understanding that we can really support then adaptation to climate risks and build resilience and really ensure that nobody's left behind in this whole process. Thanks, Alison.
Right. Thank you very much, Nadara, and thank you for making that connection with all the activities that we're doing to glaciers as well. Sometimes that seems like a really far apart sort of thing, but it's not. It's actually integrated, connected. So thanks very much for that. I'll now hand over to Pisay, Chair from WaterAid, to give your reflections in terms of what's next for yourselves.
Thank you, Sarah. So at WaterAid, our mission is quite simple. Everyone, everywhere should have access to safe and sustainable water, sanitation, and hygiene. And as climate change intensifies, we must focus on building water systems that are both climate change resilient and inclusive. So our work must evolve to address the unique needs of those diverse groups like women, men, people with disability, different ethnic groups, and other vulnerable communities, especially in the face of changing climate. This means that developing a solution that provides water services and ensure those most affected by climate impact have access and voice in shaping their solutions. So when diverse voices are included, solutions become stronger, more inclusive, and truly effective to the local community. And I believe each of us have the power to create change, whether through your work or daily life, your voice, your action, and your commitment matter. So in short, a series of small acts can lead to a great achievements in our gender, climate change, and water services. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pisay, and nicely put. We can make that change together, so let's continue to do that in all the various avenues that we have access to. Over to you, Taraya, for your final thoughts.
Okay. Thanks, Alison. Thanks, everyone. I think for me, there's a few words that jump out really clear. Can you hear me? Sorry, it's just my screen.
Yes, we can. Yeah, no problem. Yeah, we can hear you perfectly. Yeah.
Yes. So I think what Nadira has said as well, look, for us here, talking about glaciers in the Pacific, it's going to be like, I'm scratching my head here, but one of the things we've been talking about in the last week is the interconnectedness of all of these systems. And I think for us, moving on post Water for Women, it's understanding the interconnectedness and what Fraser and Jeremy have spoken to about the ecosystems and seeing how everything is connected and how we can protect that and try to ensure that these systems are resilient. I think for me, it's being intentional, moving into the future, being intentional about how we think about climate, how it impacts our communities. I think we need to be intentional about really involving not just the voices of local communities, but making sure that they're in positions to actually make decisions for themselves. And I think that's something we've learned along the Water for Women journey, and we want to take that forward. As World Vision, it's something we are incorporating into we've been working on our 5-year business plan for the next 5 years, and we're really intentional about making sure that we are involving communities and marginalized groups, women, people with disabilities into the conversations and ensuring that they're not just at the table. Alison and everyone, I think it's no longer about just being at the table. It's about being heard and being able to influence decisions wherever they are. So for me, that's the biggest takeaway and moving into the future. And thank you so much, everyone, for this wonderful journey and everyone who's actually attended. I'd like to make a really quick shout out to our university students who are on the call on the webinar today. They've been a big, we've recognized through the Water for Women Fund the importance of involving our academic institutions, and they've been involved through exchange seminars and exchange symposiums, and we actually had 2 of them from Divine Word University actually come and join the symposium towards the end of the year. Alison, you were there, so it was a wonderful time. And I think it's just strengthening those relationships again and building on what we've worked on now. So thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Taraya, for many of those kind words. And yes, again, a shout out to the researchers on board. And thank you for those 2 words, intentional and interconnectedness. The 2 I's, I think, are very, very strong words out of what you said amongst everything else. So thank you for that. Now over to you, Akila, for your thoughts.
Thank you, Alison. So in our context, given the sort of, the rising urban challenges, now that we have, demonstrated the proof of concept in 2 big cities, we would like to take this to the satellite towns in and around the cities and, demonstrate, maybe even, develop what's called a blueprint for, scaling up inclusive and resilient WASH, and not just in the urban slums, but these are all 100,000 less population. So in the city as a whole. So, create what is called a citywide inclusive WASH. So that's, will be our aspiration, and that's the direction we will go into. And of course, with that, strengthen all the transformative process, focus on inclusive strategies, constantly illustrate the tangible benefits of this kind of approach of, being both community-centric and, being able to sort of influence and change WASH systems, prioritize local participation and local communities, foster local institutions, build social capital, and strengthen the coordinated approach. In big cities, we tried our best. In the smaller towns, we are going to be able to, demonstrate it much more and create a confidence in the approach. And of course, ensure that this journey, there's also a shift in mindset. There is an acknowledgement of the whole role of WASH adaptations done with local knowledge and in a participatory mode. So all of this learnings are going to be taken forward, and, more sort of power to the, entire process is going to be sort of enabled or made to happen in the times to come. Thank you, Alison. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you, Akila. And I love your commitment to the big picture, going from the small town to the big towns in India. And I think we can all only just imagine the challenges exist, but I know they've got a dedicated team backing for them. So thank you for that. So thank you to all our speakers for that. I'm just going to put say a few closing things. As we've said all the way along, that the learning does continue. We do have a conference, as many of you may or may not be aware, which is going to be held as Climate Resilient Pathways, where we continue to explore this work that we've done and what it is that we actually need to do next. It's going to be in 2 locations. So talking about putting on challenges, we're going to try and do 2 conferences in parallel at the same time with some common plenaries. So in Bangkok and in Suva, so we get those different perspectives that are very sort of contextualized into those regions. So come and join us, as the slide says, from the 29th of April to the 1st of May. And then there's another day on the Friday, the 2nd of May, which is actually going to explore one of the tools that was flagged, the Gender and Social Inclusion Self-Assessment Tool. And that's one of the many tools that has been developed through the work of the fund, and a really, really useful way to see where you are on that gender and social inclusion journey and where you want to go to from here. So come and join us if you can. I know there'll be linkages and stuff to still come and register. Again, we will continue the discussions at that time, and I'm sure into the future. And there's a number of other learning briefs that are coming out over the next little bit as well. So thank you again to all of our speakers, for everybody that sits behind each of those speakers, and the work that they've actually drawn from and being able to present to us today. I hope you've learned something. I hope it's got your sort of juices actually flowing, and it's given you some ideas in terms of your what's next. And to finally finish up, I'd just like to say Happy International Women's Day, which has passed, but it's still important to acknowledge. And we look forward to World Water Day coming up on the weekend, where we're celebrating glaciers and all the impact of that, but also water more generally. So thanks again to everybody, and I look forward to seeing you very soon. Thank you.
Thank you.